My granddad is really the one that taught me to love the sport of fishing. Now he was more of a crappie fisherman. He would occasionally bass fish, but crappie was his first love. And from the time I was, I don't know, 2 years old, fishing was all I wanted to do. But when I was about 7 or 8, he bought me a subscription to Bassmaster magazine, and I began to read about guys like Billy and Bobby Murray and Bill Dance, and these guys that were fishing tournaments for fish to see who could catch the most fish, and were actually earning paychecks for it. And I thought, man, wouldn't that be cool to someday be able to do that? So, you know, becoming a pro for me was really the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. I mean, it's something that I've wanted to do. You know, unfortunately, God has arranged my life in such a way that I can do that. Specifically, after my years at Baylor were through, I started a small computer business, and I was fishing lots of local tournaments, everything I could get my hands on around the Central Texas area and really all over the state of Texas. And I was spending so much time fishing that my computer business was suffering, and I was spending so much time with the computer business that my fishing was suffering. And it took the wisdom of my wife really to help me make the jump. And she one day said, look, she said, you've got to make your mind up. Either you're going to have to go fishing or you're going to have to be a computer geek. And she said, you know, I know it would be expensive, and if you want to fish and that sort of thing, she said, but if you don't at least try it, she said, you're going to drive me nuts. She just knew that I would probably have regrets someday if I didn't. So she really encouraged me to take that step. You know, and I mean, that's true love right there, when your wife's telling you, okay, maybe we can deal with a little less income if it'll make you happy, and let's try it and see what happens. And so, you know, I really feel like that was an act of God, bringing her to the point where she said, I want you to at least try professional fishing. I mean, it's just a humbling experience. You know, I'll never forget the first bass tournament I ever fished. Was actually before Jimmy Sue had encouraged me to turn pro, but it's just kind of what sort of, I guess, lit the fire under me from a tournament perspective. My college roommate and I, Bruce Langford, decided to enter a Waco Bass Club tournament on Lake Belton. And you know, I thought I was a hotshot college kid ready to take on the world. And we went out there that day, and I mean, it was tough. I mean, we fished the entire day, and we didn't catch a bass. I lost one keeper, about a 13 or 14 incher. Back then in Texas, it was a 12-inch limit. And we thought, man, it was tough, and we knew we were going to go to the weigh-in. It was going to be tough on everybody. And we got to the weigh-in. It was one of those days when they were just about jumping in the boat, and everybody had caught them except us. I think every other team in the tournament had a limit, and we didn't have a fish. And that kind of lit a fire under it. It made me realize, okay, there's a lot more to this sport than what I realized. And I'm going to have to take some time and very intentionally learn this sport before I get my feet wet in tournaments again. And so that's what I did. We joined the Waco Bass Club, fished one tournament, and dropped out. And then that next year, I basically set my mind on picking one lake, and hey, I'm going to learn this lake. And then a year later, we joined Waco Bass Club again, and we were, you know, pretty consistent competitors in the club then, and began to win some events and that sort of thing. And then, you know, a few years after that, you know, for the next few years, I was fishing all kinds of tournaments across the state, and I began to win most of the tournaments that were on my home waters, and lots of tournaments even at places that I'd never been around the state of Texas. The first professional tournament that I ever fished, right after Jimmy Sue had encouraged me to, hey, quit your job and go fish for a living, was on Toledo Bend. It was called a Golden Blend Invitational, and that was Redman's kind of professional level event. It was my first time ever to fish against guys like Rick Clunn and Denny Brower and Tommy Martin and Larry Nixon and all the big names of the sport. And I'd only been on Toledo Bend about 3 or 4 times in my entire life, and I went over there and I won that event. And that was a huge milestone. I mean, it did great things for my confidence. It wasn't because I was some superstar fishing or whatever, but I guess at that point I didn't really know to be intimidated by those guys, and I went out and my focus was good. I was fishing to my strengths, and again, it's just one of those things that God orchestrated in my life. You know, probably without that win, my career might have taken a completely different path, but you know, it's kind of like the little engine that could. You start believing that, hey, I can do this. And I wish I could say that my career from there just really shot off and took off, but that was in 1990, and I didn't win my first Bassmaster tournament until 1990. 1997. I didn't qualify for my first Classic until 1996. So I had a big learning curve in there, and you know, I think that's something that most pros need to realize. With very few exceptions, there's a pretty good learning curve when you get into professional fishing. Anytime you take your competition to the next level, you know, the learning curve in football or baseball or basketball isn't quite as long because the period at which you play that game isn't as long. You know, you got 7 or 8 years as a pro in those sports if you're lucky. Whereas fishing, you've got 20 or 30 years. So a lot of times the learning curve is longer. There's a lot more to the mental side of it. There's a lot more to the gaining experience side. You know, I think one of the big things for me was when I started traveling around on tour all over the country, I began to fish waters that were different than anything I'd ever fished. You know, I'd never been on a tidal river before. I'd never been on a natural lake. Never been on really a major river system because, you know, our rivers in Texas, they only got water when it rains. You know, if it doesn't rain, all you've got to fish in is a lake. So I was good at fishing reservoirs, but most of the tour focused on these other types of waterways. So learning how to fish those was instrumental to me. And, you know, I'll never forget winning that first tournament in 1997. And I would say that was really the point that jump-started my career. Now there were some personal decisions that were going along about that time that I think really played into me even being able to win that tournament. Jimmy Sue and I, she was working as a nurse. She basically put me through fishing school. You know, you hear about people wives putting their husbands through law school or medical school or whatever. Well, Jimmy Sue was working as an RN and she put me through fishing school. And she made the decision to quit her job. I was starting to get a few sponsors. I was cashing a paycheck occasionally. We had kids on the scene and we really wanted to be together as a family, and we felt God was leading us for her to quit her job, for us to homeschool the kids, and for them to travel with me. And as she quit her job and we began to make that transition, that's when my career really took off. And I know a lot of it was, you know, I think anytime you're really following what you sense God's will is in your life, even though it may not seem like the smart thing to do financially or otherwise, you're never at risk when you follow God. I mean, it doesn't guarantee that you can start winning bass tournaments, but you know, He always meets our needs. He doesn't always meet our wants. Sometimes I get those mixed up with what my needs are, but He always meets our needs, and that was certainly the case in my career. And it's really humbling and just reminds me about the God that I serve in my relationship with Christ. When I look back at my career and look what my career was doing, which was this, until I really took a bold step of obedience to Him and began to use my fishing not as just something to earn a paycheck for me or earn a living, but you know, God, if you take this and you use it, it's got to be a tool in your hands, or it's in vain. And you know, He immediately began to use that to produce fruit in so many ways in my life. So you know, that's sort of how I became a pro and got to where I am.